I wanted to talk about not just the battlefield, but also failures of leadership, which have been acknowledged even in su- circles that support what's known as Operation Z in Russia. Military Review is probably the most popular blog covering this war inside Russia. And since in July and August, when it was clear that this counteroffensive was coming and that Zelensky needed something to show his Western patrons, Military Review is calling out the Russian MOD, the Ministry of Defense, accusing it of downplaying the strength of the Ukrainian army and embellishing casualty figures. You always hear from the Russian Ministry of Defense, we eliminated 10,000. I mean, clearly the casualty rate of Ukrainians is high, but sometimes I hear these numbers and I'm like, how many Ukrainians are there? Like they must be like,
They grow on trees.
yeah, like how can they keep making these men? And we would always hear about like the low birth rates in Eastern Europe, and it's like everyone's unhappy and no one wants to have kids, and like they're not having sex, they're just like committing suicide in bathtubs. But suddenly there's all these men and they're all dying. I mean, it just seemed a little extreme. Then they accuse. I mean, these are like the people who these critics were criticizing Putin and the Kremlin from the beginning for, in their view, handling the Ukrainian military with kid gloves, especially in the Kiev Oblast, which seemed to have, not worked out very well in Russia's favor. They lost a lot of men, a lot of vehicles there early on. They were like, just hit them hard, hit them right away. So they were accusing the Kremlin of dragging out the conflict that in a way that won't work in Russia's favor, engaging in an operational pause, which allowed Ukraine and actually its NATO advisors to prepare this counteroffensive. And they were raising the alarm about militia members in Donbass, the Donetsk People's Republic, Lugansk, of not having sufficient supplies, of not allowing the soldiers to see their families for months. Nothing was being done to correct mistakes that had been made early on in the war because no one wanted to publicly admit them, especially in the Ministry of Defense. These are the kind of op-eds that were seen in the pro-war Military Review, which refers to the Ukrainian government as the Ukrainian Reich. So, I mean, we know where they're coming from. And after Kharkiv, the Ministry of Defense was kind of silent. I mean, in stark contrast to the Russian Foreign Ministry, which is very vocal and it seems to be much more willing to engage criticism and discuss all of its moves. There's this kind of stone silence around the operational strategy from the Ministry of Defense. So Scott, what do you make of these criticisms? Were there serious failures, and can any of them be corrected?
Well, let's just start off by acknowledging that the Russians have done horribly in the information warfare spectrum, that the advantage has been seized by Ukraine and the United States and the British from day one. We control the narrative, we control the spin, and Russia's never been able to catch up. The Ministry of Defense briefings are very, they're boring. And as you said, they sometimes contain information that seems, if not exaggerated, just, if I were to prepare a report for a general, I'd give a range of things. I'd look at the combat and say, hey, look, best case, if every bullet we fired hit somebody, there's this many dead. But really, if you factor in other things, it's probably this. So the range is between this and this. It sounds like the Russian Ministry of Defense is coming in and just giving the best case out every time. So it looks rosy, rosy, rosy. And it's unbelievable. So they've yielded the information warfare battle space, which is, one thing. But now, one of the reasons why I think they did that is that they don't care. They're not out to wage propaganda. It's not like Ukraine is desperately, the Russians aren't desperately trying to get the United States to provide them with $53 billion lend-lease back. So they don't have to impress Washington, D.C. They don't have to play these political games. What they need to do is win the war. And it's a special military operation. I'll be one of, there's that saying, there's always a tweet. There's always a tweet. Well, there was when I was on Twitter, but I don't tweet anymore. So but I did. And prior to this war, I was one of the advocates that said, you know, I think Russia's going to win this thing quick, because I believed that Russia was going to basically run the version of Desert Storm on Ukraine. They were going to come in with a strategic air campaign that just wiped everything out, shut it all down. Then their military was going to come in doctrinally, come in hard, steamroll over the Ukrainians. This thing was going to be over. They didn't do that. I was shocked as anybody else. I've since then come to understand why they didn't do that, because this, before there was the special military operation, there was the economic sanctioning of Russia, which is the real war, the one that was designed to destroy Russia, to stop their economy, to hurt the Russian people, bring down Vladimir Putin. And we can't lose sight of that fact. That economic war is still going on today as we speak, but Russia has flipped the script and they're winning decisively. And the special military operation was designed with that in mind, that this wasn't a punitive effort against Ukraine. This was an effort to get rid, to change policies, to liberate the Donbass, and to get a policy redirection in Ukraine that could be inclusive of the Zelensky government remaining in power, but one that made sure that Ukraine would never be NATO, et cetera. So I understand why that, and I know I follow the Russian pro-war blogs, and they don't like that. They totally disagree with that approach. They wanted the hard approach from the beginning. So anything less than that automatically opens up the Russian government criticism, the Ministry of Defense criticism. So we need to understand there's a built-in bias there, but that doesn't mean they're wrong. And I think what happened here is, let's talk about the operational pause. There was an operational pause. And with all due respect to the right-wing pro-war military bloggers, hey, maybe go fight a war for a minute and you'll understand why there's an operational pause. There's not a military in the world that can sustain 4 to 5 months of constant combat and be combat effective. Every war, every military has an operational pause. When we invaded Iraq in 2003, we had a pause outside of Karbala because we outran our lines of communication. The tanks didn't have any more fuel. They didn't have ammunition. We needed to consolidate our communications. Wow, does that mean America was losing the war? No, it's just a reality of war. Check out World War II. Every single operation in European theater, operational pauses. You know what's precipitated the Battle of the Bulge? An operational pause. Because we just fought through the Benelux and we went, we're tired. We're going to dig in, rest, put a pause, regroup, etc. Redirect resources to Patton, who's moving down here, give some resources up to Montgomery, but it's a pause. Everybody does it. So do the Russians. They're not 10 feet tall. They're not Supermen. They're human beings just like us. They needed to pause. The problem isn't the pause. That's a military necessity. And historically, a competent enemy will seek to take advantage of the pause because you've ceased your forward momentum and you're turning the initiative over to them so they can respond. That's the ebb and flow of war. Adults understand this. Bloggers apparently don't. People who are pro-war bloggers, grow up. But here's the problem. The Russian ministry made significant mistakes. If you got a pro-war blogger who's able to accurately state that we assess that Ukraine is assembling forces in July and August, building up these forces, one would imagine that the Russian intelligence was picking this up as well. And I believe they were. I think the Russians have a great intelligence service in terms of collection capabilities. I believe they had satellite photographs that showed equipment moving in. I believe they had signals intercepts that showed that coming in. I believe they have human intelligence reports from the spies they have in NATO headquarters that showed what was going on. I think the junior analyst was sitting there going, holy beep. They're getting ready to launch a major counteroffensive. But here comes the problem, because now he has to prepare that report and it goes up to mid-level management. And the mid-level management guy goes, yeah, but what are you asking? They're going to do offensive. We hit a pause. Our troops are regrouping. You're telling me we don't have enough troops. That's what you're saying. Yeah, boss. Well, I can't go to my leadership right now and say I need more troops because the special military operation caps the number of troops we have. We don't have any more troops to give. We're in a pause. People are regrouping, refitting, etc. So you're not going to get any more troops. What I need you to do is soften the tone of this report. I need this report to be toned down a little bit so I can go up and say, hey, we think they're going to do this, but we have sufficient forces to contain it. Nobody needs to lose any sleep. This was one of the greatest intelligence failures in modern history, the equivalent of the Israeli intelligence failure in 1973 for the Yom Kippur War, when the Israelis tracked all the Egyptian preparations to launch an assault across the Suez Canal, but then said, we don't think Egypt's going to launch an assault against the Suez Canal. And then on Yom Kippur, Egypt launched an assault against the Suez Canal, and it was an embarrassing defeat for the Israelis. This is what happened here. This was an intelligence failure, a failure of imaginations, a failure of integrity, a failure of courage on the part of the Russian military intelligence. You know, an intelligence officer, and this is whether you're an American, a Russian, a Ukrainian, whatever, your job is not to tell your boss what they want to hear. That's what a propagandist says. That's what a spin artist does. An intelligence officer's job is to gather the facts, make the most accurate predictions possible, and present that to his boss as solid as possible, and let the chips fall where they may. It's not my fault that this is the information. I don't get to make stuff up but once you start massaging it, then we run into the whole Iraqi WMD thing. You know, find me a threat, make me a threat, give me the intelligence I need to back up the plan. That's not how it works. Apparently, that's how it worked for Russia. This was a huge mistake. They learned. The other mistake was because the intelligence didn't come through that called this the threat that it really was. The Russians didn't deploy their forces properly. This was horrific. What the Russians did, I mean, it's almost criminal in nature. And in fact, in a second, I'll tell you why it was criminal in nature. But the force disposition, putting a SWAT team on the front line, heads should roll for that. Not because of the SWAT team. Damn, they were brave. But whoever thought it was a good idea? That's like me being a Marine. I got all my hardcore Marine units on the front line. But I say I got to have an operational pause, pull them back to refit. Hey, LAPD, give me your SWAT team. Put them on the front line. Now, LAPD may be tough. They may take steroids. They may lift weights. They may be able to beat up gangsters. But they can't fight the fight that the Marine Corps can fight. This was stupidity, personified. There was a failure of imagination, a failure of leadership. There was a failure across the board. This should never have happened. It was predictable. If the bloggers knew about it, the intelligence knew about it, this was a massive failure on the part. And I agree with the bloggers on that this was a problem for the Russians. And I'll tell you why it's an even bigger problem. This is where it gets really serious for the Russians. When Putin sold this war to the Russian people, he gave two speeches, one on February 21st, one on February 24th. And in that speech, he invoked history. And he spoke about the Russian nation, not the Russian people. The Russian people are defined by the boundaries of the Russian Federation. The Russian nation is a collective of people, regardless of ethnicity, who are united by common history, common culture, common language. The Russian nation. Ukraine falls into the Russian nation, especially Eastern Ukraine. And since 2005, when Putin spoke about the collapse of the Soviet Union being the greatest catastrophe, geopolitical catastrophe in modern, or a geopolitical catastrophe, he caveated by saying because overnight tens of millions of Russians had been abandoned or homeless. And then he said, it is my duty as the Russian president to protect the Russian nation, not the Russian people, not the Russian Federation, the Russian nation. And then he cited that in justifying this conflict. So here the Russians come into Kharkov and they deploy their forces in there, which means in the zones that are occupied by Russia, there is a significant civilian population, the Russian nation, which is now owes its protection to the Russian military. The Russian military abandoned them. They got some of them out. A lot of them were pushed across the border.